Hey everyone, and welcome to our fourth week of business writing. This week we'll cover content strategy, we'll cover evaluation writing, and we'll cover crisis communication. Each of these things, if we were in a 15-week course, would probably get a week of their own. In fact, the usable part of recyclable and reusable content could probably get 15 weeks and its own course, but I want you to get as broad exposure as possible with these terms and concepts in our abbreviated course. So we're going to cover each of those this week. And let me share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint. And yes, as you'll notice here, the usable part of reusable is highlighted, and that's something we'll think about towards the end as we think about use and accessibility. The first thing I wanted to mention was just an acknowledgement of the really hard work that's been done on the Canvas site, particularly with the letter rewrite from last week. A lot of people in their evaluations or in their comments mentioned that this was one of the hardest assignments for them so far this semester. And I just wanted to acknowledge the hard work everyone put into it. That was a difficult assignment, and it goes back to a question that's in a lot of the literature surrounding not only business writing generally, but content strategy specifically, is this idea of in the 21st century workplace, how do we really conceive of ourselves as writers? Do we think of ourselves as writers, or do we think of ourselves more as business editors? And again, that all goes back to the central point of that assignment, which is that a lot of the writing you'll do in business contexts aren't going to be starting with a blank sheet of paper the way you start an academic essay. A lot of the times you'll get something from somebody else that you need to edit into a particular style or tone that matches the company's. So that's just something to keep in mind, but I really appreciate your working hard on that particular assignment. So let's get into the topic for today, which is content strategy, at least in part. And here's a definition from usability.gov. It's an archived website. I'll share it either in the description section below on this video or up on Canvas, or probably both. But let's start with defining content strategy, and we'll work through this definition slowly. But first, usability.gov says content strategy focuses on the planning, creation, delivery, and governance of content. And so I think the key word for us as we're thinking about this debate of business writer versus business editor is this word here, governance of content. And so now, with all the information communication technologies we have, including our cell phones, our computers, the internet, and so on, a big part of writing is just governing the content, of updating what's out there, of making sure that pages are well structured so people can find what they're looking for, of just making sure in the background, this would be the backstage, if we think all the way back to our first week, that files are saved in really appropriate places, either on a server or on a computer, that other people can come and find them. So these are all parts of writing now in the 21st century, which makes it really difficult because we're not thinking of writing simply as, hey, here's me filling up a page with some words, but we're thinking about it on this larger scale. And this sentence continues that thought. Content not only includes the words on the page, but also the images and multimedia that are used. And so, yeah, there again, we're thinking not only, hey, how do these words work? But we're thinking, to use an example on this slide, why have I used a border? Why have I used particular colors in the title? These are all things we're thinking about as business writers now. And then lastly, ensuring that you have useful and usable content that is well structured and easily found is vital to improving the user experience of a website. And so the keywords here are useful and usable, and I'll come back to that at the end of our short lecture here. They say of a website at the end, which I think ensuring these things are definitely important on a website, but definitely important on conventional ways of communicating as well. And so we'll come back to that in just a moment. But here's how you approach content strategy, and it's approached on 3 levels, much like anything else. You can think about this for your own planning of your education and so on, but it's a good system for thinking about content strategy as well. The first thing you should consider is your strategy, which is a focus on the overarching goals of the organization in alignment with the organization's values. And so strategy is on the level of the organization, the huge scale of where do we see ourselves as a group, where do we see ourselves moving forward. An objective is a focus on one part of how to reach that overarching goal. And so how do you complete the strategy? And so you can have any number of objectives to get to the strategy. So if we picture ourselves as being a diverse and inclusive organization moving forward, for example, we might come up with 5 or 6 or 7 objectives of how we're going to reach that. And then lastly, as a tactic, the everyday things that are needed, things that need to be accomplished to meet an objective. So if we've decided on 7 objectives, we take one apart and we say, how do we reach that objective? What kinds of things do we need to write? What kinds of things do we need to publish, and so on, that will bring us to that objective so we can complete our strategy. And so I know that's a little bit theoretical, but to give you a more clear example maybe of how this works, my strategy in approaching this class was I want to provide my business writing students a comprehensive UD-worthy education on the subject. And so one objective of that was that, hey, one part of learning business writing is understanding quotables. And my tactics were I'll provide one reading assignment, one discussion, and one assignment on quotables. And so you see how these tactics become part of one objective in reaching our larger strategy. And so that's the same approach that business writers or business editors take in getting information out to their various audiences. And so the other part of what I wanted to cover today was reusable and recyclable content. So in business writing, material can be reused and recycled as you think about meeting various strategies and objectives. This is a lot, this is very deconstructionist, I guess you'd say, of taking apart academic writing, right? Because we're told in academic writing, you can't even quote yourself without citing and things like that. But in business writing, that's not always the case. And so here are some examples, rather, of how content can be reused, and recycled in business writing. So on the level of strategy, you can think about if you develop a set of values or a mission statement for your organization, you want to continue to repeat those. And so those become kind of reused across media. On the objective level, or objectively, if an objective needs to be met yearly or semesterly, you'll see that you can kind of reuse content. So for example, if you want to tweet about freshman orientation every year when you're working at a university, you can go back and reuse the tweets and reuse the same kind of wording each time it comes around, instead of spending time developing a new tweet each year if what's worked in the past has continued to work. And then lastly, on the tactical level, for example, and I'll give you an assignment to think about this for this week. But if you want to reuse part of a blog post as a tweet, or a photo from an article as an Instagram post, in order to draw attention to the articles or to the blog posts, you can kind of take content over from the post or over from the article and use them on other media. And so a lot of times in business writing, you'll see that stuff just gets reused and recycled. I wanted to focus really specifically on this word usable and accessible in reusable content, just so you understand what that means in business writing. So when you're writing content, it should always be usable and accessible. But what does that come down to? Here's a couple rules of thumb, but it's deeper than this and kind of bigger than this, but just some stuff to think about. Content should always consider people of various abilities or disabilities, for example, colorblind users, deaf or hard of hearing users, blind users, and so on. And so for this, you're thinking about people who might be using screen readers. Does my website or does my page work for them? For deaf or hard of hearing users, am I using subtitles? For colorblind users, am I using really accessible color palettes that people of all abilities would be able to see or understand? And so some ways of doing this: images should have captions or alt text for people using screen readers. You'll see when you hover over some images on the internet, a little description pops up. If someone's using a screen reader, that's the description that'll be read. And so you want to make sure that all of your images have that. Content should be responsive, which in writing and content use or content development means able to work across screen sizes. So If I develop something that works really good on a desktop, for example, does it also work well on a tablet, and then even smaller on a phone? Because people have different levels of access to those technologies. Continued, some other things to think about. Videos and podcasts should have transcripts or in-sync closed captioning available. That's partially why I do these on YouTube, because YouTube auto captions videos. And yeah, if you're doing podcasts as well, you want them to have transcripts for hard of hearing or deaf users. Content should be easily translatable and written in plain language. I'll give you a discussion post this week to describe what I mean by plain language. But basically, yeah, it should be easily translatable. It should be accessible to people of all different reading levels and language backgrounds, is sort of the gist of that. There's some methods for figuring out if your content is usable and accessible. Some of these include narrative inquiry, which means just going in and asking your audience, like, hey, what do you think about this particular piece of content? Does it work for you? Why or why not? A/B testing, people in programming or marketing might be familiar with this, but basically putting out two pieces of content that have the same goal and kind of seeing if users react to one or the other a little bit better, and then realizing, hey, I can go with A or I can go with B, depending on how my audience responded. And lastly, the work of personas. You can remember the self-study or the audience profile and think about, hey, if I'm a persona approaching this content, or if I'm my stereotypical user, what kinds of things might what kind of problems might I encounter, and maybe how can those problems be overcome as well. Personas are also used often in programming to see how a network will work. So that's the end of our discussion for today. I'll give you a few discussions, or a couple of discussions, I should say, and an assignment for working on this idea of reusable and recyclable content. But thanks for listening. In the next video, we will cover evaluations writing. Thanks, everyone.